Good. So my intention today is to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we can have some questions afterwards. And the brief that I was given was to talk a little bit about where I have come from before coming to the National Gallery, and then to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we have at the gallery. So Debbie said that I started as a curator at the National Gallery in 1992, and within a few weeks of me arriving, I had a phone call from the National Gallery of Ireland saying that a new and important picture had been discovered. Would I be prepared to help to do some work on it at the National Gallery, some technical work, and to assist colleagues in Dublin to do this? It was all very, very mysterious. But when we finally opened the box that the picture came in, of course what emerged was the picture that you see on screen. You can imagine how exciting that was for a sort of 26-year-old curator at the National Gallery, the discovery of a new Caravaggio, one that had only been known from copies. The original was considered lost. And one of those incredibly happy moments where all the documentation, all the sort of history of the picture, the provenance history of the picture, and the discovery of the picture itself comes together, so that in a very short space of time, this picture became not only the newly discovered Caravaggio, but also one of the best documented Caravaggios. And the reason, of course, why they were interested in bringing the picture to us is because it had been painted for the same patron who had commissioned the National Gallery's own picture, and had been painted about a year afterwards. So the concern was to compare technique, to compare the makeup, the physical makeup of the picture, to do all the X-radiography, the technical photography, and thereby establish the autograph status of the Dublin picture. So that's how my time at the National Gallery started. It was a tremendously exciting period over the course of the 90s. I think the 90s for the National Gallery were a very, very significant moment under the leadership of Neil McGregor, where I think the gallery became a sort of beacon institution for its research, for the way in which it confronted its public role, and I think became an institution that was very admired internationally, and one that a lot of institutions were very interested in imitating the successes of. And I think that may explain why, at least in part, why I was asked to join the team at the Prado in 2002. This was a museum whose importance as a historic collection was not in doubt, but it was a museum that was very sleepy, a museum that was rather closed, a museum whose research was very seriously lagging behind, who really had very little connection with the international community, and indeed, I'd say, even with its own public. Now, during the course of the 2000s, the Prado underwent a very, very significant transformation in every aspect of its existence. And it was very exciting for me, having been at the National Gallery in the 90s, to be in the Prado in the early 2000s when this great transformation was taking place. There was a consciousness in Spain that it was necessary for this great national institution to, as it were, spread its wings, to become a bigger institution. It needed to employ more people. It needed to expand physically and intellectually. It needed to expand its programs. It needed to acquire a much greater international profile. And there were several mechanisms that were used to make this happen. The first, of course, was that the government of Spain voted a lot of extra money for the institution. The second was that a part of that money should be used towards the construction of an extension, a new building, which would provide the museum with the services it needed and it hadn't really had up to that point. And thirdly, a new team should be introduced to run the museum. Now, I'm just going to focus on essentially on the significance of the ampliación, of the extension. Now, this is the 17th century ruined cloister that lay behind the Prado, adjacent to the church of the Hieronymus, and it was decided that this is where the Prado would build its extension, and that extension would house spaces for exhibitions. It didn't have those until then. It would house the library, it would house the conservation studios, a new laboratory, an auditorium, a proper space to welcome the public, none of which the gallery had up to that point. So it really was a very, very significant but quite basic transformation that had to happen. The project was led by an architect called Raphael Moneo, and you can just make out there, I think, the museum. We saw it from the front a moment ago. And here's the extension, essentially attached to the back and incorporating that cloister that you see adjacent to the church in that area there. The extension opened in 2007, and that's what it looks like today. This is effectively the part that you see, but there's an awful lot going on underground which you don't. So the vestibule area was this. The Prado, rather like the National Gallery, was a museum where you entered the door and within seconds you were standing in front of a great work of art. But of course today in our museums we require a whole series of things to happen before people get to the works of art. It's most convenient that it does. It's about finding your directions, it's about finding a map, it's about leaving your coat, it's about seeing what the programme is for the day, and so on. And this vestibule attached to the back of the building was designed precisely to do that. Now, Moneo, who is very, very attentive to the collection in the Prado, and I think probably subliminally, he did reveal it at the end, but he was thinking, he said, of Las Meninas with the mirror in the background when he designed this view down the vestibule. And if that's Las Meninas, you can see that there's the mirror or the open door, the allusion to which I think is sort of evident there in the vestibule space. The other thing that happened is that the window helped to connect the Prado to the botanical gardens, because the Prado was part of a sort of Enlightenment scheme that involved a new museum of natural history. That's what it was originally. The botanical gardens off to one side, and the astronomical observatory on top of the hill. So it was a sort of Enlightenment science city, I suppose we could call it. As with so many things in Spain, it didn't quite, it wasn't quite completed as planned, and what was the Natural History Museum and Academy turned into the Museo del Prado. This is the interior of the reconstructed cloister, which was covered and sort of set up in that brick box that we saw a moment ago. A royal cloister for the Royal Order of the Geronimites, and a very appropriate place to display the sculptures by the Leoni, father and son of the imperial family, Charles V and his son Philip II. Now, the balcony that you see there in the middle was Moneo's big idea to bring natural light into the exhibition spaces down below. And this, of course, is something that we consider very precious. Natural light in museums is a very, very valuable commodity. We consider it absolutely crucial for displaying the permanent collections. There's more debate as to whether you need natural light in temporary exhibition spaces, but in this case, at least one of the three large rooms which make up the exhibition suite in the Prado was naturally lit, or at least there was some natural light that came down and gave a sensation of the space being more open and closer to the surface. In fact, if you look up that lantern, you end up seeing the top bit of the cloister, which you saw in the previous photo. And this was the first big display that was organised there. The 19th century collections, which had been very undervalued. People, when they think of Spanish painting, even in Spain, thought that really very little happened between Goya and Picasso. There is a whole century of production, and there's a whole century of production that happened while the Prado was already open. So the Prado is a constant reference point for practicing artists over the course of the 19th century, and that's what that collection certainly demonstrates. And I think that's a topic that we'll come back to in just a moment with the National Gallery. These are the conservation studios up on top of that building with wonderful natural light from left, right, front and back, and up above, and a large conservation scene that's able to take on very, very significant and challenging works. This huge altarpiece from Seville Cathedral, for example, or the Murillo Immaculada that you can see at the far end. And the Prado at this point became a sort of campus rather than just a museum with several buildings around the main building of the Prado. The extension, which is there adjacent to the church. Over here, the Kazan, which was part of the old Buen Retiro Palace and has a major fresco by Luca Giordano that became our research centre. And then this final part, which has now been incorporated into the Prado. This is the section known as the Hall of Realms, and it's essentially that piece of the palace built around the great hall for which Velázquez painted the Surrender of Breda and that series of battle pictures by Zurbarán and Carduccio and so on, painted in the 1630s for Philip IV, practically all of which are in the Prado's own collection. So this is what the Prado looks like now, but if you imagine that one coloured blue, that gives you an idea of how the Prado was growing, breathing, and extending its ambitions as a place for research, as a place for major exhibitions, and as a place for international collaborations. And I think that opening up internationally was one of the absolutely central elements to the success of the Prado over the course of the early 2000s and into the current decade. This is the interior of the research centre. This is the research library, the archive, and indeed all the curators are in this space, and spaces for teaching and for welcoming fellows, the fundamental elements of any research centre, but very much focused on the research on the collections themselves. So these are the two founding pictures for both institutions, similar in some ways, but rather different in others, and I think reflecting the quite different character of the two institutions. On the left is the portrait by Bernardo Lopez, showing Queen Isabel of Braganza. This is a posthumous portrait made at the end of the 1820s, and she was considered and was effectively the mind behind the creation of the Prado, encouraging her husband Fernando VII to deposit collections from the royal palaces around Madrid in this museum and to open it to the public. You can see that she's taking a very, very direct interest, because she's actually got one hand pointing at the museum and the other hand at where the pictures are going to hang on the wall. So this is a curator queen who is demonstrating her very, very close interest in the development of this new institution. Well, on the right-hand screen, and dating from about the same time, is the portrait of Lord Liverpool, who was the Prime Minister at the time of the founding of the National Gallery. And he too shows himself with a document which reflects the founding act of the National Gallery, the creation of the National Gallery. Now, the differences are significant in as much as this is, on the left, an act of royal generosity. This, on the right-hand side, on the other hand, is not a royal museum which is being opened to the public. This is Parliament, which is acquiring a group of works in order to create a National Gallery for the people of this country. There's a very different approach there. One is very much sort of from above to below. There's a much more democratic process at work in the celebratory portrait on the right. The National Gallery was conceived from the beginning to be an institution for people to visit, for people to feel that the collection was in some sense their own. I'll demonstrate this in a moment. And it was a place which they should be able to visit free. You'll all know the origins of the gallery, so I shan't go into them, but in 1824 the gallery was able to acquire, or rather the government was able to acquire, the collection of the financier John Julius Angerstein, and this became the basis of the National Collection. Initially it was shown in his own house at 100 Pall Mall. There's a selection of pictures which had belonged to him, and also some other pictures which had been added in the interim. This is a view from the early 1830s. You can see the very large Sebastiano del Piombo. But the rules for visiting this building, which was a private house, had been turned into a public gallery, are contained here. They're probably quite difficult to see from where you are. But at the very top it says, regulations for the exhibition of the collection of pictures purchased And this is a really significant phrase. It's surprising how, with just a few words, an institution can sort of characterize itself. Pictures purchased for the use of the public. These pictures have been acquired for the public to make use of them from the executors of the late Mr. Angerstein. And if you look at item 2, it says all persons to be admitted gratis upon application at the door. Now, these are guiding principles which have been present at the National Gallery from the very beginning of its history. From that very moment where the regulations get written, so that the public knows how to behave when they come in, right through to today. The idea that the gallery and its collection are there for the use of the public, for the gallery for the public to enjoy, for the public to feel in some way that these works are their own, a sense of possession, which I think is very, very difficult to emulate when the collection is being presented as a gift from above and the royal family deciding to open the doors of a museum to the public. So the National Gallery was very rather well visited from early on. If you imagine it was just a private house at 100 Pall Mall in those early years, and you can see there at the bottom, these graphs I think are quite helpful to have a sense of how the gallery develops over the course of the 19th century. Less than 100,000 people a year visiting, but this was, after all, a private house. The significant leap, of course, happens in the late 1830s, because it's in the late 1830s that the National Gallery opens on what will become Trafalgar Square, effectively this bit of the building, half of which was used by the Academy, the Royal Academy, and this half which was used by the National Gallery itself. So that peak in visitors begins there. And then we got this very fascinating peak here, 1851, great cultural event in London, of course, which is the Great Exhibition. And if you look at the graph up above, what you find in 1851, you have, as it were, the equivalent of half of the population of London visiting the National Gallery in that year. So this is an institution which is extraordinarily successful and has an extraordinary appeal to the general public. Another interesting peak is this one up here in the late 1870s, and that coincides with the opening of the Barry Rooms, which are these rooms here behind the main facade, and of course are still the most glorious, I suppose, rooms in the gallery. So a great sort of cultural event, effectively the creation of a new ampliación, a new extension to the National Gallery, leads to a very kind of significant leap in visitor numbers, which sort of tails off after a little while. There are reasons for that. But look at this space here. These, of course, are the war years. It's not that people didn't go to the gallery in the war years. It's that we don't have records for the numbers. But, of course, as everybody knows, there was the picture of the month at the gallery, and this was the first of them. The entire collection was evacuated just a few weeks before war was declared, and it took until 1942, and that famous letter to the Times, where the correspondent says, "Because London's face is scarred and bruised these days, we need more than ever to see beautiful things." So an appeal is made to Kenneth Clark and to the trustees that at least every now and then a picture from the nation's collection should be shown to the public in London. Music lovers are not denied their Beethoven, but picture lovers are denied their Rembrandts, just at a time when such beauty is most potent for good. So this is, in a way, the sort of key example of how the public wants to use its pictures, and how pictures can have an extraordinary impact on the public. You can imagine, I guess, in 1942, and this is something that's been pointed out again and again, with many soldiers on the front, with many people having died already in the war, this particular Titian of the Noli Me Tangere, Do Not Cling to Me, must have had the most poignant resonance for the visiting public who were able to see it during the day. And as you all know, the picture was taken down into the vaults of the gallery at night. So the trustees had to weigh up the risk of showing the picture against the obvious benefit to public morale in showing the picture in the gallery. So it was shown for a month, and then of course there was a whole sequence of pictures of the month. So once again, I think the gallery in its history has a stunning example of the way in which the pictures have tremendous kind of purchase with a very particular historic moment and with the public of its time. The gallery, of course, has an astonishing lurch forward in 1991 when the Sainsbury wing is opened. This, I think, was very interesting to compare and contrast with the Prado's extension, because the Prado's extension was paid for entirely by the Spanish government, entirely by the government, at a figure of about 150 million euros. This was something that I think even in Britain in the 1980s would have been completely unthinkable. And indeed, I'm sure you all know the sort of history leading up to the creation of the Sainsbury Wing. There comes a moment where it can only happen because the government and the authorities at sixes and sevens over what's really going to happen with this site to the east, to the west of the main Wilkins building of the National Gallery, that it takes the Sainsbury brothers to step up and to say, we will pay for this building in its entirety. And the government commits to paying for its upkeep. But this, of course, is another very kind of significant step in the way the gallery has responded to public need for more space, need for the kinds of facilities that we were describing for the Prado. The National Gallery had a small auditorium, now it has a proper amphitheatre. It didn't have proper dedicated exhibition spaces. The Sainsbury Wing provided that. Spaces for the Renaissance collection, so that the pictures were able to spread over a much wider space, and indeed the creation of some of the finest galleries I think that have ever been made in any museum. But not only that, a sort of completely new way of thinking about the collections, of sort of taking the public by the hand and conducting them through an itinerary which was reflecting what was happening in contemporary art history, where people were thinking much more broadly about sort of cross-border connections between artists who travelled, the sense in which artists from the south looked to the north, and vice versa. And the spaces, as designed in the Sainsbury Wing, were intended to transmit to the public, as it were, the latest research in art history, and to enable them to experience that in a very, very practical way in front of the works themselves. Because, of course, that's the very special experience that any museum can offer. You can actually take the public by the hand, you can allow them to go their own way, and they can stand in front of a work of art and have an encounter which is to do with an encounter across time, an encounter with significant subject matter, and an encounter with a creative force from the past, all of which, and each in their own way, can be tremendously exhilarating. The presence in front of a particular surface, the presence in front of an object which has been manually created and which has been the result of accumulated artistic and aesthetic wisdom. I said before that the Sainsbury Wing also provided an exhibition space, a dedicated exhibition space, which allowed for the gallery to explore aspects of its own collection, to draw the public's attention to bits of the collection and to examine those in much, much greater depth. And I'm just showing you here one example of an exhibition which I think works extremely effectively. I'm sure most of you saw it, called The Sacred Made Real, and focused on the relationship between painting and sculpture in Spain in the 17th century, and the idea of painting imitating sculpture, and sculpture, of course, imitating painting as well. Now, of course, talking about visitor numbers brings us to one of the significant challenges for the gallery now and into the future. The gallery has, over the course of its history, had these moments where it's kind of gone up to the next plateau. And certainly the opening of Sainsbury's was a case in point where, from the 1990s, the gallery was regularly having about 4 million visitors, and that takes us through to the middle of the first decade of this century. And then you can see there's a sudden lurch again, probably as a result of what we call the sort of halo effect around the Olympics, where London became increasingly attractive to an even larger number of foreign tourists. And that has had a very significant impact on many of the cultural institutions and tourist attractions in the city. So you can see from sort of 12, 13, we're above 5 million, and then in more recent times, hovering around the 6 million visitor mark. Now, I do find these figures absolutely fascinating. They reflect, I think, the success of the National Gallery as an institution. And remember that the invention of the museum is not an especially old one. I mean, really the first great sort of public museum is 1793, the Louvre. And the museum has turned out to be an extremely resilient and extremely attractive and successful creature, and has found ways to adapt to the times, to a growing public, to looking for ways to make itself significant at various points in its history. And that's certainly the case with the National Gallery. Public interest in our museum institutions, I think, is an all-time high, as Debbie intimated at the beginning. And I think this provides a remarkable potential for the gallery to play a significant cultural and educational role. It also, however, raises a series of problems which are partly of a practical nature. How do you deal with that sheer volume of visitors coming through a historic building which certainly wasn't created for that vast number of people, but also with the quality of the visit. How can we ensure that people who come to the gallery when they're coming in these sorts of numbers have an encounter with works of art which is significant, which is in some way transformational, which doesn't end up being a source of irritation and frustration, but has the potential to open up possibilities to provide both education and entertainment, which were the sort of founding principles on which many of our museums were established. So the question of spaces in our gallery is one that's very pointed for us, and one that we need to confront into the future. We can't know exactly whether those are the sorts of figures that we'll have into the future, but it looks as though it's very likely that we'll be dealing with these large numbers of figures, large numbers of visitors into the future. So at the gallery we took some very quick action very recently. This is a rather boring plan, but if you think of the gallery as being essentially a main floor experience where you essentially travel along the heights, the peaks of European artistic tradition, all on the main floor, the gallery also has a ground floor which provides relief space, but also some rather attractive galleries for special displays, very often for decanting space, I have to say, when work is done upstairs. And then Gallery A, which was designed some years ago to act as a sort of small teaching National Gallery, taking you through from the gold round paintings from the 14th century right through to pictures of about 1900, and designed principally for teaching. What the problem was that these galleries were unconnected to these ones here, and so simply by opening this gallery, which we did about 2 months ago, you all of a sudden open up the entire ground floor to the public. You enable the public to flow through the building at ground floor level as well as main floor level, with all the facilities that are provided on the centre and the east side of the building. And I think this has brought about some quite welcome relief for visitors for the collection. But of course it's only one small step, and I think the thinking of the gallery must move on in terms of how we accommodate these large numbers of visitors, how we make the experience as rewarding as possible, how we show the collection to a 21st century audience, how we incorporate the new technologies to enhance the visit to the gallery. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. That's the look of the new Gallery B. Do come and look at it if you haven't been to the gallery in recent times. We've done a special display. It allows us to step slightly outside the traditional display that the gallery has, which is to show artists, particularly when they're present in strength in the collection, to show them quite separately. And here we are able to show Rubens and Rembrandt in the same space, and really invite the public to think about the way in which the two artists are confronting the big historical subjects, how they're confronting portraiture, how Rembrandt is looking over his shoulder at what Rubens had achieved and looking to differentiate himself while being hugely admiring of what Rubens had done. So the collection, of course, is the very heart of the National Gallery. The collection and the building, I guess, these are the two central focuses for anyone thinking about the National Gallery. And the gallery has very successfully built up its collections over the course of the 19th century and the 20th century to become the sort of jewel-like collection which we have today. It's not a large collection. You may not realise the gallery only has paintings. It doesn't have sculptures, drawings, decorative arts. It is an entirely sort of flat art collection. And it is a collection of only 2,400 pictures. There are no more than that in the collection. Only 2,400 pictures, of which we show on the walls currently just over half of the collection. So you are seeing a very, very substantial bit of the collection. Just to compare, the Prado has a collection of 8,000 paintings, as well as sculpture, drawings, decorative arts, and so on. And it shows about 1,500 paintings in the main building in Madrid. But of course, the very quality of the collection provides a challenge in its own right in terms of how you're going to develop that collection. And remember that it is a statutory obligation of the National Gallery to extend its collections, to enhance its collections, according to the 1992 Museums and Galleries Act. And of course, it's something that we're very conscious of, because as our knowledge increases, as the discipline of art history also extends, and as public cultural interests broaden, the collection has to in some way reflect that. In 1905, there was a remarkable opportunity to buy the Rokeby Venus. It was a very welcome addition to the collection. As most of you will know, this Punch cartoon, Desirable Aliens, has Velasquez carrying the Rokeby Venus under his arm, and Sargent carrying the portrait of Ellen Terry's Lady Macbeth into the National Gallery, being welcomed by Punch. So a very welcome addition to the collection, one that came to strengthen what was a small but very choice Spanish collection, and a collection which has been enormously admired for its quality, even though its scale is small. And certainly, so far as the development of the collection is concerned, the notion of adding excellence to excellence, of strengthening those bits of the collection which are so significant already, has marked some recent acquisitions. For example, the spectacular acquisitions just a few years ago of the two Sutherland Titians, the late mythologies, part of that series of Poesiae, of which the Diana and Actaeon, or the Death of Actaeon, which was already in the collection, was probably meant to be a part of when Titian painted it. These were acquisitions, as you probably know, made in conjunction and collaboration with the National Gallery of Scotland, which has had them for many decades on loan, and acquisitions which were made with the support of many private individuals, foundations, but most significantly, of course, the lottery and the art fund. But the collection has moved in different directions too. The gallery is a gallery essentially of European paintings, but it seemed appropriate at a certain moment to look beyond the borders of Europe to artists working in the European tradition. And perhaps the most significant acquisition in recent years in that respect is the purchase of the George Bellows Men of the Docks. This is a scene in New York, but I think the DNA of the picture. The character of the picture, I think, is very clearly related to particularly the tradition of painting in France in the 1870s and 1880s. And then very recently, a picture from the very same year by the Danish artist Ring, which has just joined the collection just over a year ago, and is this curious combination of sort of northern symbolism and what I suppose is a quite sort of cool and even cerebral naturalism. So areas of the European tradition which have not featured significantly in the gallery's collecting are now beginning to be a more central part of it. But the question of how the gallery extends its collection in the future, of course, is a very live one in terms of which directions we might take, both within European painting, but also in terms of how far forward we come in time, and that's a fruitful discussion that we're having with the Tate. If you come to the gallery right now, you'll find this in the Sunday room. Some of you might be horrified, some of you might be thrilled, but this is, of course, Chrysophiles' newly designed and newly woven tapestry, showing what he's titled The Caged Bird's Song. The title is based on this figure here of this man who's carrying a caged bird. And this is the all-enveloping setting which Chrysophiles has designed for the display of this new tapestry. So it's a sort of syncretic work that brings together the tradition of Matisse, of the mythical landscapes of the 17th century, of Poussin and Rubens, even of Domenichino, this strange sort of temple dancers who appear around the walls, all done in a very traditional, the tapestry itself, the very traditional technique of weaving in the same way as Rubens's tapestries were made in the 17th century, or indeed Burne-Jones's in the 19th. And you might say, well, what role does this have to play in the National Gallery? And I'm very clear about it. The National Gallery is a reference collection for so many contemporary artists. And my view is certainly this, when you look back across time, you have a sense of this great flow of artistic production, and it doesn't suddenly stop. It transforms itself, it becomes something different, it seeks to address audiences in a different way. But there is a continuity, or certainly one can focus on a continuity between the artists of the canon, as it were, and what a large number of artists are doing today. We had the experience of working with this artist before, Chrysophiles, when the Titians were acquired, and we invited several artists to make works in response to them. Now, what does that mean, to make a work in response to a National Gallery painting? What you're really asking the artist to do is to enable the public to look at the historic collection through their eyes and to have a new, fresh, renewed experience of the historic collection. Not only that, but that is a very, very significant element, and it seems to me that fits in absolutely naturally with what the National Gallery should be doing and what traditionally it has also done. Here is, for example, the picture on the left, which Lucien Freud had in his own collection, and desired at his death that this picture should come to the National Gallery itself. So an artist who has been much inspired by works in historic collections, including the National Gallery, both in his style and his subject matter, and one who wants to repay, in a sense, the National Gallery with works from his own collection. And this became the focus of an exhibition that we did last year called Painters' Paintings, where we were able to look at the National Gallery's collection not from the point of view of the artists as producers, but the artists as collectors, the artists who have certain works around them as they produce their own art and are inspired by those works, and those works often end up joining works by those very artists themselves in the public collections. The most obvious example of that, I suppose, is Turner, who wanted his pictures to come to the National Gallery and specified that 2 of his pictures should be shown in relation to Claude's, which were in the National Gallery's collection. And we are both tied by tradition and by obligation to do that in the National Gallery. So you will always see these 2 pictures together, Claude's Seaport and Turner's Dido building Carthage. And in another sort of facet of this relationship between National Gallery's collection and how practicing artists respond to it, we're going to do an exhibition soon on the influence of Jan van Eyck on Pre-Raphaelite painters. Now, this painting was the first early Netherlandish picture to come into the collection. Rather astonishing to think that that was the first picture to enter the collection in 1842. And if you think when the young Pre-Raphaelites are working sort of mid to late 1840s, the influence of Van Eyck is instantaneous on their work, not only in the subjects that they take up, and the exhibition will focus on the significance of mirrors and reflections in their work, given that the mirror in the Van Eyck was such an admired element in the picture, but also the astonishing attention to detail and the challenge of the finely wrought work, which you see, for example, in Millet's Mariana. That is a special collaboration with the Tate, and I think it's also important that we begin to see over the next few years the national collections working much more closely with one another. It's only natural. These are national collections. They are owned, as it were, by the public, and it's, I think, very suitable that we start looking at opportunities to collaborate closely together, not just in purchases, as we did with the National Gallery of Scotland, but also in all kinds of other projects, whether those are research or documentation projects, whether they're in teaching projects, or indeed exhibition projects of the kind that this might be an example of for the future. My final example for how a contemporary artist, as it were, finds a place in the National Gallery is George Shaw, who's our most recent associate artist. This is a scheme that has been operating in one form or another for more than 20 years at the gallery, where you invite an artist to take up residence in the collection, to live with the pictures, to live with the staff, to live with the public, and then produce a body of work that is the summation, in some sense, of their experience in the National Gallery. It can be a remarkably rewarding experience. It can be a particularly rewarding experience when the artist involved is particularly eloquent or loquacious even about his interest in the National Gallery. And anybody who knows George Shaw will know that both those adjectives can be applied to him. And here you see the artist in his own distinctive style responding to the 3 great Titian mythologies in the collection. If you look very closely at them, you can see that the references become quite obvious. The Diana Actaeon on the left, the Diana and Callisto in the middle, and then the death of Actaeon on the right, with the wounded, transformed hunter, as it were, leaving a stain of blood on the tree. So both playful and ambitious, and an artist who had not really painted on this scale before and hadn't really painted in this particular technique either. So seeing his own work transformed by the relationship with the gallery's own pictures. This is the funding bit. I will be very brief, but again, very kind of illustrative graphs here. These are our visitor numbers growing. This is our grant in aid going down over more or less the same period. So that in itself, of course, provides a very, very significant challenge. You could say that museums are expensive in the greater scheme of things. I think they're not expensive at all. They're tremendously good value for governments. But the general trend does unfortunately seem to be in this direction here on the right. It does, of course, make institutions which are very heavily dependent on public grant and aid rather vulnerable. And we need to find new models for financing our public institutions. Some institutions have moved ahead very rapidly. The gallery, I suppose, is still very heavily dependent on grant and aid. You can see that we're around about 65% still. So the gallery needs to find ways in which to extend its own operations, its own self-funding operations, whether that comes through development money, whether it comes through commercial activities. And certainly we're all looking very hard at aspects which we can exploit, which are dignified and which do help us to maintain our public commitment. So we're looking very significantly, and this is happening across the museum landscape here as well, of course, at events in the gallery, mostly outside of ours. We're looking at various opportunities for licensing images, particularly in the big emerging markets in the Far East. And we're also looking to digital to be a significant source of revenue in the future. Now, the gallery, of course, has a great tradition of scholarship. When I arrived at the Prado, I was really very astonished that the collections had not really been catalogued. We were still working from the inventories of the 1850s. The gallery, on the other hand, has been very thorough in its cataloguing, and a very distinguished cataloguer at the National Gallery sitting at the back of this room right now. So there's been a long tradition of cataloguing the collections, cataloguing them rather thoroughly, and not only are we on the first editions, but in some cases we're on the third editions or the third wave of cataloguing of the same collection. So the accumulated body of knowledge, the accumulated deposit of knowledge at the gallery is, I think, almost unparalleled anywhere in any other museum institution. And certainly the gallery has been a model of how to catalogue its own collections. And I think it's important to realise just whereas very few people may actually read the catalogue that you see on screen, Lorne Campbell's splendid 16th century Netherlandish paintings catalogue. Nonetheless, it's the research of the curators, whether they're in-house curators or invited curators who are doing the catalogue research, which forms the basis and the foundation for pretty much everything that the gallery will say about its paintings, everything it will want to transmit about them. And it will do that through its teaching programs, through its public lectures, through its exhibitions. And of course, exhibitions are an extremely important activity for the gallery. There's a very significant element of keeping the public in the gallery, keeping the gallery in the public eye through its exhibition program. But it's also about exploring its own collections. It's about showing its research. It's about bringing to London or bringing to the institution aspects of the painting tradition, which may not be very extensively covered in the London collections, or it may be bringing together for a period of several months things which are not normally shown together. So, for example, right now at the gallery, you can see this particular juxtaposition, which I think is an absolutely fascinating juxtaposition, but one that in normal circumstances you simply can't see. So the importance of exhibitions, the moment of exhibitions, the idea that you're convoking the public to come and see something which is only happening now is terribly important. So the exhibition becomes both an opportunity and an event. It becomes a significant source of revenue, and that shouldn't be forgotten either. But in a sense, as a public institution, your concern is that the work which is being done internally, the technical work, the research on the collection, finds an outlet. The exhibitions is a very, very useful vehicle, and one that I think has proved itself extremely effective. But of course, we are confronted now with the challenge of digital. This is a completely new world for us, and we are very much in a kind of transitional phase. We don't yet know where digital is going to take us. It's taking us to some extremely interesting places. And it really has the possibility for us to fulfill our public mission in a way which was kind of unheard of or unthought of even just a few years ago. Because digital can provide you with unlimited archive space. It can provide you with a very extensive sort of ongoing rendition for constant use of what the institution is actually doing. And it can provide levels of access which are just unthinkable, or which were just unthinkable a few years ago. So on the National Gallery YouTube channel, you've got another Courtauld alumna speaking about Botticelli, what is traditionally just an event which takes place in the gallery in front of maybe 50 or 60 people, suddenly can be viewed, for those who are interested, across the whole world, and in theory, forever. So there is the potential for unlimited communication, and this is something which the museums, I think, are coming to grips with and trying to find the best way to move forward. Now, this is a shot from Facebook Live, which museums have become very interested in and actually have remarkable potential. This is in conversation with the curator, Matthias Wivel, of the Michelangelo Sebastiano exhibition. But I did a Facebook Live, the first one ever I did, on the Caravaggio exhibition. The first one I ever did, that's what I mean. And of course, you're looking at the viewing figures, which are going up as you speak. And then, of course, get higher and higher, if it turns out to be interesting, of course. So within a few hours, this Facebook Live thing, which was done, with a telephone camera, had been viewed by more than 300,000 people. This is the kind of audiences which are simply unthinkable, and audiences throughout the world, and no doubt audiences who will never come to the National Gallery. So suddenly the outreach, or the reaching out of the gallery, does truly become global. This is a fantastic challenge for a museum institution to find the very best way of fulfilling its mission. Communication with the outside world, but also, I think, the challenge of enhancing the experience within the institution, and that, I think, is a challenge that we haven't yet sorted out. I'm not necessarily speaking about augmented reality or virtual reality. We're very conscious that visiting the gallery itself is a very real experience, but technology does provide, I think, often quite unthought of possibilities for enhancing the experience of the real when you are actually in the gallery. Now, I'm drawing to an end, so we can pass to the questions at the end of this talk. But the challenge of the gallery kind of stepping outside of its own walls, I think, is one that every museum is now having to confront. The very fact that we are called the National Gallery means that we're a gallery for the nation, and nation is people as well as a geographical space. So how does the gallery confront its responsibility as a national institution when it has a collection which is rather small, which is extremely precious and physically sensitive, but at the same time fulfill its role and its responsibility to a population which is spread across the whole country? And certainly in the last few years we've seen museums taking on that responsibility very, very seriously. And the gallery too, particularly with its loan programmes, I can assure you that any sort of serious loan request from a British institution will be entertained generously by the National Gallery, because we're very conscious that it's important that our pictures be seen not just in London, but also outside of London. And finally, if I can finish on a slightly more flippant note, stepping outside the gallery, sometimes we have to do that on our very own doorstep. And we've done that on a couple of occasions quite recently. Trafalgar Square is a big issue for us. You'll all be familiar how difficult it can be sometimes to get to the gallery as you cross the North Terrace on the square. I've often said the quality of the entertainment there, I think, is improvable. But I think it's also for us to kind of step outside as well, and we did this very recently to mark the exhibition we devoted to Dutch flowers in Room 1, and this was a sort of collaboration with the Dutch Flower Council, who created this enormous tableau made entirely out of flowers. And then more recently still, outside our front door this theatrical group from southern Italy called Quadri Plastici, who for many decades have been recreating famous paintings, and on the occasion of the Caravaggio exhibition recreated the picture that we started off with at the very beginning of this lecture. Thank you very much.